Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the annual Literature, Cognition and Emotions lecture. That this lecture, the invitation of Siri Hustvedt, has been made possible. That is the merit of the Faculty of Humanities that gave us funds to do research about literature and to bring literature to the people. So I give the word to the Dean. Please. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to say a few words. As the Dean, I sometimes get the opportunity to talk on behalf of the whole faculty. At times this can be a bit uncanny, but this is not such an occasion. So it's a great pleasure for me, on behalf of the Faculty of the Humanities here at the University of Oslo, to welcome Siri Hustvedt, who will be giving a talk with the intriguing title on Poetic Logic. It's an extra pleasure to welcome Hustvedt, since she is, among many things, an honorary doctor here at this university. Good to see you come back to Oslo. This event is organized by the interdisciplinary hub Literature, Cognition and Emotions, one of 5 interdisciplinary projects given priority and funding by the faculty for the next 5 years. On their web pages, Literature, Cognition and Emotions list 3 major research topics. Emotions across culture and languages, culture and cognitive memory, and the last, literature as a life world technology. Truly intriguing, topical and interesting themes. And what's more, they aim to explore these topics in an interdisciplinary manner, bringing together literary studies, linguistics, psychology and neuroscience. This project then is part of a concerted effort to facilitate change, to build bridges to other academic disciplines and intellectual traditions. And in bridging, one might also hope that you in this project are able to tear down some walls and silos, that you can help build an even stronger interdisciplinary culture here at the university. I hope you succeed in this endeavor, and in this regard it is fitting that you have invited Siri Hustvedt to come and give this talk, since she is an interdisciplinary author and intellectual, moving with elegance and eloquence between different fields and traditions. Literature, Cognition and Emotions is also close to heart for me personally, since literature is my discipline. That is, in my real or ordinary life, I am an Ibsen scholar. And Ibsen's plays are literature, albeit literature written for the stage. And they stage emotions very often. They display people talking about their emotions, trying to understand them and their relation to the character's own past, in ways that open up existential, psychological, as well as ideological or political issues. And as an Ibsen scholar, I do from time to time meet people who find his plays boring and tedious. This is a fact, regrettable, but still a fact. And what they most often say when they try to justify their view is that they find his plays cerebral. That could of course mean that they think the plays lack sex and violence, but it probably also points to the fact that his plays are, in some ways, like clockworks, which has some truth to it. One of the things that I've come to respect more and more in Ibsen, however, is his poetic intelligence. He was a smart man who knew what he was doing, but his plays are also full of what he himself called dævler and galskaper, devils and madnesses, the not so rational, but all of it still done with logic. And even though Siri Hustvedt is a very different writer in innumerable ways, this could perhaps also be said of her. Her latest novel, bearing the paradoxical but still logical title, Memoirs of the Future. So, once again, welcome to Oslo.
Thank you very much for this thoughtful and generous welcome. I would now like, on behalf of Literature, Cognitions and Emotions, like to underline what a great honor it is to have Siri Hustvedt for our first annual lecture. Literature, cognition and emotions loop together in multiple ways. We understand literature as something that reflects the mind and its movements, its motions and emotions, its deep ponderings and flights of the imagination. But literature does not only reflect thought and feeling, it also provokes them, it guides us and perturbs our relationship to ourselves. It puts you in touch with yourself, but also sets you beside yourself. And this is certainly an experience that you can have when you read Siri Hustvedt's novels. From her early works, such as What I Loved, to more recently The Blazing World, or Memories of the Future, which came out earlier this year. And those who have read her know just how good she is at putting you into these strange places. Those of you who haven't read her, here's your chance. But beyond the effect that literature has immediately on the reader, Hustvedt also actively engages with much broader concerns. Take her novel, The Blazing World, where she takes the title from a 1666 text by Margaret Cavendish. Cavendish, the 17th century philosopher, engages with natural science, philosophy, and what we would call today psychology. She engages in theoretical reflections, but presents them to us through romance and fiction. Cavendish is not the first writer to take a narrative fictional format to investigate what we would consider scientific matters. Francis Bacon got there first. His New Atlantis is quite different, however, and I think this is to do with the fact that Bacon doesn't really get fiction. He doesn't really understand that you can get at the truth by pushing reality further than it usually goes. This is exactly what Cavendish does. She introduces exuberance, glamour, and ironic redoublings, for example, when she appears as her own self in this very novel. While Cavendish engages with the likes of Descartes and Hobbes, Hustvedt, in her Blazing World, brings in contemporary neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and other forms of discourses about the mind. She probes them for their inconsistencies, reveals their pretensions and potential, and she also challenges what she herself calls the delusions of certainty. And I think you've seen some of these delusions of certainty in, say, airport bookshops being sold under names like Pinker and Dawkins. Hustvedt puts literature on a footing with other domains of knowledge. She always underlines that it has something to say about cognition and emotion, and not simply about what cognition and emotion are, but also how we can go about studying them. And this is very much what we hope to pursue with literature, cognitions, and emotions. For Hustvedt, as for us, literature is a form of knowledge in its own right. She brings this into dialogue with other forms as well, most obviously the essay in her essay collection, A Woman Looking at Men, Looking at Women. For her work, both in the literary and beyond the literary, Hustvedt has, of course, received a number of prizes. The Blazing World was longlisted for the Man Booker in 2014 and received the LA Times Book Prize. For her work as a scholar and a thinker, she has received, you've already heard it, an honorary doctorate from this university, but also from the universities of Grenoble and Mainz. She has been awarded for the essay Delusions of Certainty, the Prix Européen de l'Essai, and very recently the Princess of Asturias Prize, where in the laudation, in particular her intellectual contribution as a thinker and scholar was highlighted. We're delighted to welcome such a distinguished speaker to hold the first LCE lecture, someone who has explored literature both as a practitioner and a thinker, investigated its half-forgotten truths, and brought about its not yet existing futures. I give you Siri Hustvedt.
I have to turn, I'm on. Okay. I was going to turn myself on. Thank you very much. My father's favorite course was Ibsen. He taught Ibsen, and he had this technique of bringing his students in emotionally, and so he would speak very loudly at a dramatic moment, and then he would get quieter and quieter. I don't quite have that dramatic technique, and thank you, Karin. I hope this this talk, which is called Poetic Logic, and it's going to move between little things and big things. I will begin my journey through questions about memory, imagination, emotion, and fiction in light of cognitive science with a story about my mother. My mother is 96 years old. Her mood is usually good. The sweetness of her personality is intact, but her memory is bad. She doesn't recall what she has just seen, heard, or read, and is often confused about where, what, and when, and sometimes who. But to date, she has never mistaken one of her 4 daughters for another. Although my mother and I used to spend a lot of time talking about fiction we both loved, those dialogues are now over. Nevertheless, she can sustain a pleasant conversation, remembers much of her past, particularly her childhood and youth, and has a rich vocabulary in 2 languages. 3 years ago, in 2016, her memory was a little better than it is now, but she rarely remembered what I had just told her and would often repeat the same question many times. Over the telephone, she asked me how my book was going. A safe inquiry, as I am always writing a book. And I told her I had paused from work on a novel to write an introduction for the Folio Society's edition of Persuasion by Jane Austen. My mother said, "Oh, Persuasion. Siri, isn't it just terrible when Anne goes to the window and sees her cousin with that woman?" I was stupefied. If I had not just finished rereading the novel, I'm not sure I would have immediately identified the scene, which comes late in the book. Mary Musgrove has spotted Anne Elliot's cousin, Mr. Elliot, heir to her widowed father's estate, due to male succession, very important in the book, a charming but inscrutable, and as the narrative develops, we discover hypocritical and morally compromised man who has been highly attentive to Anne. According to Mary at the window, he is conversing with that woman, Mrs. Clay, another person of dubious character who has been hard at work trying to wrangle Anne's silly father, Sir Walter, into a second marriage. Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay are both people who have designs on the Elliot estate, but they are at cross purposes. In the room with the 29-year-old Anne is the man she has loved since she was 19, Captain Wentworth, but was persuaded to give up due to an unsuitable, risky match, a decision she regrets sorely. Anne responds quickly to Mary that it can't be Mr. Elliot, as he is supposed to be traveling, a comment that reveals she knows his schedule and which she fears will lead Wentworth to surmise an intimacy that does not exist. Quote, to pacify Mary and perhaps screen her own embarrassment, Anne did move quietly to the window. She was just in time to ascertain that it really was Mr. Elliot, which she had never believed, before he disappeared on one side as Mrs. Clay walked quickly off on the other, end quote. Despite her impaired memory, my mother demonstrated a vivid recollection of a passage in a work of fiction she had read long ago. She did not recite the words of Austen's text aloud to me. That form of memory is rare. My guess is that, like most people, not all, she remembered a mental image, not a page of signs. At the time of her reading, she had enacted a common form of immediate translation from symbols to sensory images of a person moving in space and looking out a window. Years later, my naming the novel triggered a memory of that visual and motor imagery, and walking, pausing, and seeing the two in the street below, accompanied by the emotional charge the scene had had on her, revealed in her use of the words terrible and that woman, as well as the emphatic inflection I heard in her voice. My mother remembered a scene she had imagined from a work of art, itself imaginary, and its effective meaning for her. Is it possible to parse this moment of remembering imaginary people in imaginary space inside my mother's mind, brain, body through cognitive science? Classical or first-generation cognitive science spent little time on feeling and imagination as forms of knowing because they didn't fit well into a model of the mind as a series of algorithmic operations on symbolic representations that mirrored a universal mental reality, or mentalese, to borrow a term invented by the analytical philosopher Jerry Fedor. This neo-Cartesian model conveniently isolated the mind from the body, which meant that it could be studied independently of the material in which it was instantiated. Margaret Bowden articulated the split in a 1979 paper when she suggested that understanding the programs that regulate human behavior might open a path to understand how it is, I'm quoting her now, to understand how it is possible for the immaterial mind and the material body to be closely related, end quote. Cut off from the body, including the brain, the mind's software could theoretically be realized in any kind of hardware, namely another kind of information processing machine, a digital computer. In the last 4 decades, the body, feeling, and imagination have returned to cognitive science. But they have returned in several forms with different emphases. George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, who coined the term second-generation cognitive science, are often credited with initiating the turn to embodiment in the field. In their book, famous book, Metaphors We Live By, 1980, they claim that metaphor is not fancy decoration and literary language, but a mental function rooted in the body. We could only understand the mental in terms of the physical. More recently, many of you know, the 4 E's have gained popularity. The mind is embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. To say that ideas about what all this means are not uniform is a wild understatement. Still missing from a number of the varying theories of embodied mind is the trajectory of the human organism's growth and development over time. Its history. The embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended subject is usually an adult and is implicitly male. Also underemphasized in some accounts is the role other human beings play in the creation of this embodied mental reality. not merely as objects among other objects in the environment, the abstract surroundings in which the subject is embedded, but as beings essential to his intersubjectivity, shared human meaning, which can be located in that important but somewhat blurry area between people. I have long argued that the relation between a person and a work of art is an intersubjective one. A book carries inside it the symbolic markings of a living human being, in this case, Jane Austen. While I am reading her book, Persuasion, the words of the novel effectively replace my own internal narrator. The text will always be exactly the same, but my as-if experiential reality, the one I create as my eyes scan the words, changes with every reading. As Paul Ricoeur repeatedly points out, in Time and Narrative, reading is at once passive, I receive the words, and active, I construct a reality for them. Their meanings also vary according to reader in time and place. They are enlivened by the dialogism of Bakhtin, not by static dictionary semantics. Words are infused with relations of place, power, class, and personal history. Although Persuasion is written in the third person, the book's action all happens from Anne's perspective, communicated to the reader through indirect speech. I listen to Mary chatter to Anne, and then I walk to the window with Anne and glance into the street with her, almost as if I am she, but not quite. And I feel the meaning of the passage as emotionally marked in my body, not as terrible in the way my mother felt it, but as puzzling, disturbing, and worthy of notice. Think of all the growing and learning and knowing and feeling and imagining that were required for my mother to have her flash of memory. She had to develop inside her mother's body from zygote to embryo to fetus, move in birth outside her mother's body, grow as an infant, and then become a speaking child in a family, one who learned to read first in Norwegian and then in English, and eventually turn into an adult, attuned to the nuances of Jane Austen's novel that delineates elaborate social exchanges that take place in a particular world at a particular time, and which mines the emotional pain of a woman's exclusion and isolation within it. Anne's status as an unmarried 29-year-old woman in the world of Persuasion is akin to being nobody. My mother's recollection of a moment in a longer narrative hinges on her own story in a wider culture, which is necessarily part of her relation to the book, a relation which is not an I-it relation, but an I and as-if-you relation, a relation established through her imaginative living into the scene that made it terrible for her. We are not born reflective readers. The human infant may be fed and clothed, but if it isn't held and talked to and touched and rocked for a long time, and if it doesn't form crucial attachments to others, it will not thrive. Neglect and trauma affect development. The now vast literature on attachment is vital to understanding cognition. If we forget that human beings, the most social of all animals, begin neonatal life as utterly helpless, dependent creatures, far more dependent than most of our fellow mammals, many of whom stand up and walk around only minutes after birth, then we are missing the protracted social development that is essential to our species and is crucial to our elaborate cultural reality that includes reading and writing. If we are to take embodiment seriously as generative of imaginative and symbolic reality, then we cannot pretend we were all born adults. The mind-body division implicit in classical cognitive science was bound closely to artificial intelligence. According to the physical symbol system hypothesis of Newell and Simon, quote, the symbolic behavior of man arises because he has the characteristics of a physical symbol system, end quote. The computer metaphor for mind eventually became literal. There are countless reasons why the paradigm had to shift, but here is one. Although readers must learn to interpret symbols, they grow up driven by feeling in a social world with others. Machines do not. Descartes famously began his quest for truth with his fully adult self and his doubts. I have read Meditation on First Philosophy many times, and I always find it thrilling. His certitude famously arrives with the cogito, I think, therefore I am, which is also the root of his substance dualism. Mind and body are two substances. Nothing beyond him explains his I, Descartes tells us, not even his parents. In one fell swoop, he cuts the umbilicus to the past. But Descartes also wrote The Passions of the Soul, a treatise on the emotions. For him, the passions were mental states that have bodily states as their causes. With notable exceptions, intellectual love and joy have no bodily antecedents. He regarded the passions as useful and significant for moral life and noted that they have sensory precursors, pleasure for joy and pain for sadness. Further, he maintained they may occur without conscious thought, and a part of the brain, famously now, the pineal gland, was the locus of fantasy or imagination, and it mediated between the sensual body and the thinking mind. In passionate intellectual opposition to Descartes and his legacy, the Italian philosopher Giambattista Vico located certitude elsewhere. In The New Science, this is the third edition, 1744, he wrote, this is a beautiful quote, "The certain began in mute times with the body." For Vico, the imagination is a primary faculty, the imaginative universal. He develops a phylogeny and ontogeny of the imagination dependent on sensual and affective bodily experience, from which springs metaphor and myth, both of which partake of poetic logic, an organizing principle of the world. When his early humans were mystified by events, they projected themselves onto their worlds in anthropomorphic metaphors. He gives examples: the brows and shoulders of a hill, the eyes of needles and potatoes, and mouth for any opening. In his story about the origin of language, Vico creates his own myth. Early people who communicated by gesture and monosyllables responded to thunder and lightning from the heavens and shouted in terror, attributing fury to a great shuddering body in the sky, Jove. The sensual link between the visual and the oral, along with the emotional jolt of fear, set in motion what for Vico becomes increasingly abstract and conceptual over time. Sensation and emotion evolve into metaphor and then rational thought. Quote, but these expressions of the First Nations later became figurative when, with further development of the human mind, words were invented which signified abstract forms or genera comprising their species or relating parts with their wholes, end quote. Vico's poetic logic is not algorithmic, not Descartes' step-by-step path to truth and certainty. Cartesian logic involves mathematical reasoning, which seeks to eliminate all problems of blur between steps through the rigorous isolation of each link in the chain. In mathematics, this is possible, although Gödel's incompleteness theorem cast doubt even on this. In biology, things get much messier. Vico's embodied psychology is a flowering of sensual experience into metaphor and story that involves a bleeding of bodily experience onto the world, which is not dictated by reason, but by metaphorical connections. His argument for his science was founded on the study of the human mind through what it had made. What Wilhelm Dilthey, lifting from Hegel and influenced by Vico, called objektiver Geist, objective mind, the products of human cultures. Rather than hierarchies or linear steps, Vico proposed mingling. Quote, memory is the same as imagination, and thus memory has three different aspects. Memory, memoria, when it remembers things, imagination, fantasia, when it alters or imitates them, and ingenuity, ingenio, when it gives them a new turn or puts them in a proper arrangement and relationship, end quote. Most people manufacture inner pictures of the past in autobiographical memories, but they also produce images in fantasies about their futures, as well as images when they read fiction, which imitate, alter, or put a new spin on what is remembered. In order to read Persuasion, my mother had to imagine the space where Anne walks to the window, a room perhaps rearranged according to her knowledge of Bath in the earliest years of the 19th century, perhaps not. My husband confessed to me that when he was a teenager and read Pride and Prejudice for the first time, much of the action took place in his parents' living room. There is no autobiographical memory without place. And if one forgets the place where the memory happened, it is necessary to supply one, although the shift of location happens unconsciously. In The Shaking Woman, I tell the story of a humiliating memory from when I was 4 that occurred at my aunt's house. Years later, I realized that the space I was seeing in my mind was the house my aunt and uncle moved to years later. The house where the event actually happened was no longer accessible to my memory. I am suggesting that all of these mental spaces partake of Vico's poetic logic, a shifting amalgam of memory, imagination, and ingenuity. Vico was familiar with Cicero and the ancient traditions of artificial memory systems, in which a specific connection between the words of an oration, for example, and imaginary places, topoi or loci, had to be established. The speaker memorizes his words through the imaginative act of walking through a familiar architecture. In The Art of Memory, Francis Yates quotes the unknown author of Ad Herennium, a text on artificial memory, composed between 86 and 82 BC. Quote, what we see in everyday things that are petty, ordinary, and banal, the author writes, we generally fail to remember them because the mind is not being struck by anything novel or marvelous, end quote. The ancient author goes on to advise marking the sequential mental spaces with hilarious, frightening, or obscene human figures. Yeats comments, quote, our author has clearly got hold of the idea of helping memory by arousing emotional affects through these striking and unusual images, end quote. 2 millennia after Ad Horennium, William James wrote in his Psychology, an experience may be so exciting emotionally as to almost leave a scar on cerebral tissues, end quote. Suzanne Langer, the American philosopher whose theory of symbolization in general and the arts in particular originates in the affective and motor sensory realities of the human body, is more precise. Art, she wrote, is the objectification of feeling. The neuroscientific finding that emotion consolidates memory corroborates this ancient insight, although I have never seen this connection mentioned anywhere in the literature. Research suggests that the release of neurochemicals and hormones that accompanies strong emotion acts to strengthen episodic conscious memory of life events. Further, the emotional impact of an experience seems to endure even when its particular details have faded. Studies have shown that Alzheimer's and amnesia patients who have no memory of having seen a sad movie retain the feeling of sadness without conscious recall of the film. In fact, their sadness may outlast that of people who can remember the content of the film. Perhaps because in the patient's regulation of the emotion is compromised, they can't say to themselves, it was only a movie. Despite her dementia, my mother's memory from Persuasion burned into her present. Over the years, one reader after another, far too many to count, has approached me with a version of the following. I just love that book you wrote. You know, the one with the artist and the boy who dies? I cried so hard. What was it called again? Reading, like all human experience, has an effective music with lulls and crescendos. The crescendos mark memory with what Antonio Damasio calls somatic markers. When a version of past experience emerges in the present, it is marked by feeling, an alarm signal or incentive signal, crucial to decision-making, which is always future-oriented. This feels good or bad, and I decide accordingly. Vico's Jove story serves as an originating myth of the somatic marker hypothesis. Fear drives the story of the sky god. A quote I have returned to again and again in my writing life is from Henry James. In the arts, he wrote, feeling is always meaning. In life, meanings without feeling are likely to vanish. Emotion not only consolidates memory, it plays a role in the reconsolidation of memory. Memories change because they are unconsciously reimagined. Memories dependent on the context of their retrieval are subject to Vico's fantasia and ingenio, reconfigurations molded by the fleeting circumstances of the present. As the molecular biologist Christina Alberini puts it, it is becoming increasingly clear that memory formation and storage are exquisitely dynamic, end quote. Contemporary neuroscience has undermined the idea of a permanent, incorruptible memory. Yet another reason to cast aside the computer metaphor. But Hermann von Helmholtz, Wilhelm Wundt, William James, and Sigmund Freud all subscribe to versions of the same idea. Because we have the text, we know that my mother's memory from the book wasn't a delusion. In Persuasion, Anne does walk to the window and she does see her cousin in the street with that woman. From the perspective of cognitive neuroscience, there are several insights that might be made about my mother's brain at the moment she recovered the scene from the novel. But caution is in order. Methodologically, the neurosciences are invested in eliminating as much blur as possible from their research. But a good deal of this work moves ahead through a vague appropriation of the classical computational model of information processing, mingled with locationism, the idea that a psychological state can be related to a locus in the brain and called a correlate of that state. The broad assumption that oxygenated blood flow is a sign of increased brain activity has led to the familiar pictures of brain scans with hot spots in red and cooler spots in other colors. These images serve as a geographical map onto which various mental states and animal behaviors are pinned. At its worst, this results in absurdities such as explaining a finding of greater connectivity between hemispheres in the brains of women than in men as proof of woman's intuition. Locationism is old and founded on much earlier anatomical findings in neurology through autopsy. Damage to a certain part of a brain can be reliably linked to the problems of language comprehension or a lack of inhibition or memory losses, for example. Nevertheless, two people may have an injury that appears to be nearly the same and have different symptoms, probably due to plasticity, the reorganization of synaptic connectivity in the brain in relation to experience. There is no agreed-upon theory of how the brain works, a fact that has caused countless people in the field to leap upon various versions of Bayesian prediction theory as a new computational model to rescue them from the lacuna. The situation then is that although the field is overwhelmed with data, various models of the brain-mind are in competition. And furthermore, no scientist can read a brain scan backward. No researcher will find Anne at the window in my mother's brain. Aristotle's phantasmata, mental pictures, are not revealed by fMRI. We have access to them only through self-report. This is, of course, what David Chalmers called the hard problem. How is subjective experience related to the objective realities of brain locations, their connectivity, and neurochemicals? From an epistemological perspective, then, it is important to maintain healthy skepticism about these studies without denying that there is interesting research afoot. There is no one-to-one correspondence between my mother's readerly response to a passage from Persuasion and a brain area. Automatic reduction from her memory to neurons means losing the rest of her body and her contextual reality. Nevertheless, at present, it is safe to assume her hippocampus was involved. This discrete area of the brain remained for some time the site of rival theories. It was thought to be involved in memory, chiefly because of studies on human beings, or it was believed to be involved in spatial navigation, findings that came from studies on rats. The discovery of hippocampal place cells in the brains of rodents that fire in relation to where they are in a maze and then refire in their sleep is, to say the least, fascinating. Stimulating a place cell with a drug while the rodent sleeps causes it to run to the real spot in the maze when it wakes up in the morning. It's La Lyon, 2015. It's wonderful. Mammals do seem to have topoi on the brain, learned topoi. The hippocampus is now credited with playing many roles, from aiding flexible social cognition and behaviors to spatial perception and navigation, to thinking about the future and constructing imaginary scenes. Scene reconstruction theory combines memory, imagination, and space. Eleanor McGuire, Helene Intraub, and Sinead Mullally define it this way. Here's a quote. This is the theory. It posits that a primary function of the hippocampus is to facilitate the construction of scenes by allowing details to be marshaled, bound, and played out in a coherent spatial context. In this way, scene construction is held to be a vital ingredient not only for episodic memory and imagining the future, but also for spatial navigation and scene perception, and I would add, for reading novels. A further clue to how memory and spatial understanding work in tandem has been found in what is called boundary extension, which is simply this. People remember having seen more of a picture than they actually saw. They recall what lies beyond its borders. This is referred to as a memory error or false memory in the research. It is also an imaginative form of addition and completion. We fill in because we have navigated spaces. Participants in the study remembered objects cropped at the edges of an image, not as partial things, but as whole objects. People with bilateral hippocampal lesions, however, damage to both sides of the brain's seahorse, which impairs both their memories and their ability to imagine, had a far more accurate recall of half objects and image boundaries than people without lesions, but great difficulty imagining the surrounding space when they were asked to extend it. Readers have no external image to remember, only the internal one they invented. Jane Austen does not describe rooms, clothing, or facial features. There is no window dressing in her prose. The reader fills in what is missing. Austen's world is one of thoughts, emotions, and actions that occur always in relation to others. It is impossible to read her novels without a keen awareness of the constraints and openings provided by the rules of social expression and conduct. After spotting Mrs. Clay in the street, Anne confronts the woman, quote, "She only roused herself from this brooding agitation to let Mrs. Clay know that she had been seen with Mr. Elliot 3 hours after his being supposed to be out of Bath, for having watched in vain for some intimation of the interview from the lady herself. She determined to mention it, and it seemed to her there was guilt in Mrs. Clay's face as she listened." No physical detail is included, but I am conscious of guilt in Mrs. Clay's face. Do I see it? Not vividly, but I, the reader, recognize and feel some consciousness of guilt in the woman's expression. I participate in Anne's emotional detection. Haven't I felt both my own guilt and the sight of it in others? The much discussed and much argued over discovery of mirror neurons in the premotor cortex of macaque monkeys in the 1990s, neurons that fire both during the execution of an action and during the perception of that same action, a version of which is at work in human beings, has been proposed as the underground of intersubjectivity, a pre-reflective neurobiological mechanism that contributes to shared meaning, which is also applicable to reading. Numerous studies have shown that action sentences or clauses, and did move quietly to the window, engage sensory motor areas of our brains involved in performing the same action. Metaphors such as "she had a rough day" arouse the sensory cortex. Remembering a visual scene seems to activate the visual cortex, as do other forms of mental imagery. Reading appears to involve a simulation of acting and perceiving, or what Antonio Damasio referred to as the as-if body loop. Interestingly, silent reading engages both the auditory and visual cortices. Several studies have shown that reading to oneself involves as-if imagery of speech. Vittorio Gallese calls such phenomena embodied simulation, and he borrows a term from Merleau-Ponty to describe it: intercorporeality. In Merleau-Ponty, intercorporeality serves to illuminate relations between one body and another as a reciprocal, reversible, sensual reality between like beings that are not physically attached to each other. According to Gallese, embodied simulation is, quote, a non-conscious pre-reflective mechanism of the brain-body system whose function is to model objects, persons, and events. In their paper, How Stories Make Us Feel, Toward an Embodied Narratology, Gallese and Hanna Wojciechowski, I'm sorry, she's not here, fortunately, argue that engaging with narrative fiction is liberated embodied simulation. They note an obvious but important fact. The reader of fiction isn't actually moving. I sit or lie down to read, and this passive posture liberates me to virtual action, opens me to sights, sounds, actions, and feelings in the world of the book. But what is required for these imaginative visio-motor sensory processes that produce phantasms while reading? Embodied simulation is unconscious. My sense of Mrs. Clay's guilt is conscious, an as-if face-to-face experience through Anne. Infants seem to be born with imitative capacities, especially of faces. They respond to the sound of their mother's voices. And it is now known that late in gestation, fetuses respond to acoustic and tactile stimuli. Newborns don't see well, but they are more attracted to faces than objects. When other infants cry, they cry. The sound has contagious qualities. Their movements can be wild and uncoordinated. I remember putting mitts on my newborn so she wouldn't scratch her face. There is a trend in infant research to attribute all kinds of abilities to newborns and even fetuses, some of it warranted and some of it unwarranted, in my view. I have a paper that addresses this specifically, but here I would like to stress certain lacunae in the cognitive sciences. It is helpful to think of the embodied human subject as a process, not a static object, a process that is in continual flux from fertilized egg onto death, an ongoing homeostatic dynamic that responds to its external and internal milieu without an absolute border. Dynamic reciprocity is a phrase now used in genomics to describe the complex interaction between gene and cellular environment. Indeed, without the cellular environment, a gene is inert. There is entanglement and mutual action. In 1983, Richard Lewontin argued that an organism is both subject and object of evolution, a position that echoes Jacob von Uexküll's idea of Umwelt and creature-environment circle, in which the animal makes and is made by its surroundings. And most crucially, it is through this back and forth that subjective meaning for it is created, a meaning that is produced through relation. Examples are illuminating. Isolating a prairie vole from its fellow animals stops neurogenesis. Separating a rat pup from its mother can alter its molecular structure by methylation after DNA replication. I know that methylation studies are controversial. The social circumstances and behaviors of the clownfish prompt a complete hormonal reorganization of its gonadal reproductive system that results in sex change. Where and when and how does conscious human cognition or knowing enter the picture? There are many theories, no consensus. For Vico, reason or reflection, knowing that we know, is both a historical development of humankind and a story of individual development from childhood to adulthood. Although notably, maternal origin and gestation are not part of his poetic reality. Along with most thinkers in the West, Vico avoided the maternal body as the original human locus. Nevertheless, Vico is trenchant on development. As I pointed out in the Delusions of Certainty, Vico has a mirror stage. The child sees his mirror image, recognizes himself as an other, and is set on the road to mental self-reflection. In Vishian thought, reason and reflection are not an inherited trait of the species, but one developed in and through culture, the sensus communis. It is the imagination that generates consciousness, language, and culture. Certainty is not found in the thoughts of an adult man alone meditating in front of his fire. It is found much earlier in the lived body before speech in tandem with others. D.W. Winnicott, the English pediatrician and psychoanalyst, examined mirroring behaviors between mothers and infants by reworking Jacques Lacan's mirror stage. He also reinvented Freud's notion of the transference as, quote, an intermediate region between illness and real life, that's Freud, as a normal part of human development. He called it a potential space, or, quote, intermediate state between the child's inability and growing ability to recognize and accept reality, end quote. For Winnicott, this is a space of play, an imaginative transformation that is neither inside the psyche of the child nor outside in the external environment. It is between the two, and that is where cultural creativity flourishes. The between is a difficult locus in philosophical and scientific discourse, often erased as a reality because it is conceived as empty of content or of mingling and mixing content. The between disturbs the Cartesian step-by-step procedures by which we are meant to arrive at clear and distinct ideas. There is both blur and leakage, ambiguity about what's inside and what's outside. Either or is comforting. Both and is squishy and disturbing because it raises the problem of borders. Infant research on attachment since Bowlby wrote his masterwork, Attachment and Loss, has come to rely increasingly on empirical microanalyses of engagements between what is called the dyad, the two-in-one unit of parent-child that is described as a mutual engagement of attunements, mirroring, synchronies, and proto-conversations that have a psychobiological character. Daniel Stern, influenced by Suzanne Langer, turned these exchanges of gesture and visual acoustic communication, babble and words, within the dyad into a larger rhythmic musical composition that relies on repetition to produce patterns of effective meaning acquired over time, which then come to be expected. The baby links being carried into a particular room and its smell with a familiar routine. The intonation of his mother's voice with the unbuttoning of her blouse. The sound and feeling of a rocking chair. The sensation of her hair in his fist, her arms around him. The feeling of her warm skin, the tactile sensation of her breast with the pleasures of feeding. Infancy is probably a time of synesthesia, before the senses become distinct. Sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch mingle in a miasma of sensations given meaning through feeling. The repetitions acquire a poetic logic founded on the recognition of amodal sensory patterns. This motor sensory affective predictive relation turns on the speechless infant's relation to the speaking adult, without which there can be no movement into so-called higher cognitive skills. There are now many studies that link attachment style not only to emotional well-being, but to narrative, reading, and math skills. Human development is slow. And as uncomfortable as this truth is for Western philosophy and science, it doesn't begin at birth, but in utero, inside a woman's body. And the zygote embryo fetus does not grow independently of that woman, but is physically attached to her through a transient but crucial organ, the placenta, an organ that develops both from maternal and fetal cells and orchestrates cellular exchange between the two. New research on the organ, inevitably identified as forgotten, ignored, and unknown, is exciting. But when infant researchers turn to fetal development, they ignore the placenta. It is as if the fetus is floating without support, a little man on his own. A view reinforced by textbook images of its development that often lop off the placenta, placental cord, and most, if not all, of the mother's body, including even her uterus. Embodied cognition has repressed the 4 E's of pregnancy entirely. The embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended reality of fetus placenta in maternal space is missing. There is no mention of it in the Oxford Handbook of 4E Cognition, published in 2018. Despite this gaping hole in the literature, it is a primary example of intercorporeality. The 4E folks are not alone. This blindness to or avoidance of maternal origin is a repetitive theme that runs from the Pythagoreans onward in Western culture. A potential being that begins as a fertilized cell becomes a cluster of cells which through reciprocal maternal fetal processes is attached to and then embedded in the mother's uterine endometrium and develops from there into the tripartite system of fetus and mediating placenta dependent on nutrition from the mother simply isn't included in the current literature on theories of embodiment. It is also missing from its philosophical antecedents. It is stunningly absent from Uexcu and from Varela and Monterana's theory of autopoiesis, and Merleau-Ponty, who uses pregnancy metaphors continually and whose chiasmic theory of the flesh is as close to an image of pregnancy as any in philosophy, fails to make the leap. It is a long road from zygote to reading subject, but that is my point. Rats don't read. Our prematurity, which new research suggests has nothing to do with the human infant's big head or its mother's pelvic size, is part of our species being. A species that is far more diverse than any other animal. We live in a world of almost 7,000 extant languages. The languages we speak are not of an immaterial mind. They do not relate to the body, as Margaret Bowden argued. They configure the material of mind through the sensus communis, part of the dynamic reciprocity of human creature and an Umwelt of others. Literacy alters the brain, as Stanislaw Dehaene's research has made clear, but there is much that we don't know, much that is murky and undecided and repressed, and much that escapes the models devised to explain what human beings are. And admitting this is a sign of rigor, not laxity. I suspect that the consciousness wars are in part the result of a long-standing obliteration of the between as a pregnant zone of both ambiguity and generative possibility. During the Nazi occupation, my mother lived in Askim, Norway. One day, she was walking down the street, and she saw her brother in intense conversation with the school teacher in town. It was a terrible moment, because as she told me, I knew. Soon after, hours or days, without exchanging a word about it, my mother and her sister went out on skis with their brother. She remembers waving goodbye to him. Aided by members of the underground, he skied to Sweden, where he spent the rest of the war. I don't know whether the real sighting of the two conspirators in the street shaped my mother's imaginative sighting of Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay. I do know that the middle-class Norwegian world in which my mother grew up emphasized decorum and moral rectitude, and that my mother, even now with her failing memory, has an uncanny ability to detect the subtleties of feeling that pass between her and another person. There can be no science of cognition or reading without feeling and its subjective meanings, which is always already intersubjective meaning. There is no reading without poetic Logic. Thank you very much. Are we doing questions? Sure. Yeah.
We have now time for a couple of questions from the audience after Siri took us so wonderfully through reason and
It's like this. Yes, I know. You have to get somewhere. Yeah, I know. It's like the fast tour. Anyone? We won't say first question.
Will you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hear you. Where is the person? Okay.
I can.
Okay, go ahead.
Wait.
Yeah.
You started off with Vico
Yeah.
and the art of memory, and you mentioned the relevance of the marvelous
Yeah.
for his conception of memory and poetic logic.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder where you see this, for example, in Austen, and also in the work on memory that you related to Austen so carefully. Because it seems to me the marvelous is a poetic category that is, well, I don't know if it loses its functionality between Vico and Austen, but something happens to it.
Yeah, and also, I mean, Karin and I were talking earlier about, predictive coding, and Carl Friston, of course, has this idea of surprise, right? That consciousness is when you have to, we run on autopilot, and then when we see something, the marvelous, which Vico stresses, right, then we have to reorient we have to use consciousness, right? Most of the time we see what we expect to see, and then this intersubjective reality between my mother and Austen created something about that sighting in the street, which was different for my mother than it is for me, but it has to do with surprise. And it is surprise, that moment in the book, I think, for any reader, because these two people are supposed to be acting against each other. They're both conniving people, and we know that. But why are they conspiring in the street? It's very exciting and, marvelous, because there's no explanation up until that point. So, I think this is important. I mean, I think we can make those connections between these ideas, say, in neuroscience, and Vico, who seems to predict all kinds of thoughts in later science without ever getting much credit, by the way. I always feel like that's my job to show how, Vico was there way before that important turn in cognitive science. Someone?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Lynn. Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I was wondering what your thoughts are on whether you can separate the art from the artist. We did have a very interesting debate in Norway earlier this winter due to the Michael Jackson documentary.
Oh, right.
Whether or not it would be... it was debatable whether you could still play his music or watch Woody Allen's films, or, for example, read Hamsun, for example. Yeah,
this is an ethical question. I can, as someone who writes novels, I can definitely say that I often feel that novels are being generated without my complete permission. And that, I think, artistic process is often that. Now, this is not to be, I don't mean to be cynical or funny or anything, but if we were going to put all of the artists, over the ages to a moral test, there wouldn't be that many people left. I would really have to empty out my library of some fairly crucial books because, the people weren't very nice people. And in fact, sometimes they were horrible people. I happen to love Louise Bourgeois, and I was sitting at a lecture like this, not the speaker, but say right beside me there was a woman, and she leaned over and she said, I saw the lecture you gave on Louise Bourgeois, online at the Museum of Modern Art. And she goes, I knew her. And I said, I didn't. She goes, she was terrible. She was a horrible person. And I said, well, I've heard that. So I think that, it doesn't mean you can't create a moral condemnation, right, of the life. But I think it's a little risky to start, banning books or preventing people from consuming art that has even art that itself is morally dubious, because maybe we need to have that. We need to have discussions about why it's morally dubious.
Thank you for your nice and interesting talk. I have a question about attachment.
Yeah.
Which is a commonly agreed upon thing.
Yeah.
In your opinion, do you think that it starts within the womb, in the uterus? And I don't know about the psychologist. Their idea is that they start after the child has been born, right?
Right. Well, this is this very... one of the things I said in the lecture is that we've got a newborn, right? Since infant research, Daniel Stern was one of them, the idea, Piaget's idea, for example, of the newborn, or Freud's idea that there was no differentiation between the mother and the infant. This seems now to have been quite clearly proven not to be the case. But I've also noticed this tremendous will to autonomy of the newborn and the fetus, which I think has gone too far. And I think it has some ideological traces there. The newborn can do everything. As I said, I remember I had to put mitts on my own new baby because her arms and legs were waving all over the place. She, could hurt herself. So I think this has gone a little far. Someone like Trevarthen, whose work I really admire, but he does attribute so much ability to these newborns that I think, and now they're talking about intentionality in the second trimester in, utero. Well, okay. These are these kind of debates. Maybe bacteria has, intentionality, or single cells. We could, what are we talking about? So I kind of fall in between here. I think in the very late in pregnancy, they're doing sort of studies on rhythm. And that when, I certainly felt this, but now this has been actually studied, that when you lie down as a late pregnant woman, the fetus wakes up, this almost to be born person, and then goes to sleep when you walk. So in a paper that I was talking about walking, not, human beings, but actually the human gait is felt before birth in the motion of the mother. And, that may say something about human rhythms and the way rhythms developed. And I think that has something to do with narration and prose as well.
Other questions?
There's some.
Thank you very much for a great lecture. I'm a writer, so I have a kind of curiosity about this. You talked about the reading experience, and then how this connected with your personal life, and this fantastic idea of this having kind of its birth in Norway with your mother. Seeing this episode on the street, which all these things seems to be fantastic as fiction as well. Aren't you afraid of talking about this? Could you go back and use it in a novel? Is it kind of, and how would it feel, and what would be
Well-
different? It's a huge question. I'm sorry of the size of it, but I'm rather curious. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's like, do you hoard your material, right? I really do move back and forth between fiction and nonfiction, and I think one of the reasons I wanted to tell that story about my mother is that it's a way to ground fairly abstract thoughts, right, about various fields in something very concrete, that very tiny passage from Jane Austen that my mother, who really is losing her memory, nevertheless, it's sailed across the years, and she seemed to have a pretty important memory of it. So I think that in, nonfiction work, too, being able to ground what you're saying in particular experience has tremendous merits. And, I'm interested in the narratives of science as well. And talking to scientists, you often understand that the form of the science paper is so restrictive that scientists don't get to tell their good stories, about the accident in the lab that resulted in this great paper that got published in Nature. And if they hadn't had the big accident, they never would have known. Actually, mirror neurons, it was a big accident. This scientist happened to notice one of the monkeys, that was like single neuron gauges, and he noticed that the same neuron was firing when one of them was eating a banana and the other was just watching. Total accident. They were trying to do an experiment on something else altogether. So, I think that story now has been told, but mostly they don't get told, right? Or you find out you're testing some drug and people's hair starts to grow. Becomes the hair growing drug. Nobody knows why the hair grows, right? I think these narratives are important in every discipline.
Hello, thank you so much for coming today. I just had a question about, because you briefly mentioned artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, according to the hard problem that you keep coming back to in your works, do you think that we'll ever be able to program consciousness and intelligence? Do you think that the hard problem can ever be solved?
So my annoyance with AI is not that, actually coming to Norway, I feel like the whole country is running on. My hotel, I hardly see anyone. There's no telephone in the room. Everything is automated. I have to figure it out, So I think AI is coming. It's here in Norway. New York is way behind. But so it's not that AI will not continue to develop. There's all kinds of amazing technology. What has irritated me is the general popular expectation that tomorrow we will have these humanoid figures with emotions and consciousness and creativity that will be able to, order a dinner and then have a witty conversation for a couple of hours. If you look into AI work, any honest AI person will tell you this is so far away from being possible. And that's what annoys me. This fantasy, science fiction fantasy, which has informed a lot of AI, there is something about how the imagination fuels fields. You talk to these AI people, they all have a story about how they saw Star Wars or 2001 or who are those? Yeah, that little R2D2, has inspired tremendous work. But it's and you can have a cuddly little AI thing, as your friend. But the idea of truly dialogical feeling others at the moment is just not on the horizon at all. So I'm a little annoyed by the cultural fantasy, which we must want, because otherwise the fantasy wouldn't be there. Somehow people really want artificial creation. It's a birth fantasy. It's very old. And I think it also has to do with hopping over maternity, one of the biggest omissions in the history of the West, right?
Could I ask, you said something about new theories about how attachment style is connected to reading style or narrative style? Or so if somebody has an ambivalent attachment style or an insecure attachment, will they be an insecure reader, or how does it work?
Okay, I have a little story because I was on stage with Antonio Damasio, who I mentioned a couple of times, and is a friend of mine, and I like Antonio enormously. And we were talking about reading. And he confessed something I found very interesting. He said when he gets really caught up in a work of fiction, when he's really feeling it, that he has to withdraw to recover himself. I never have to. I mean, I kind of just, I think, go there. And then I thought, so what is that need to retract? That would be something interesting in reading style. Right? Is that about attachment? He actually seems to be a very securely attached human being to me. Antonio, says, doing just fine, thank you. But I would think that attachment, that dialogical reality, would be very important in our reading, and the degree to which one gives oneself up, right? Because, okay, this is my favorite quote of myself. Art is like sex. If you don't relax, you won't enjoy it. I really mean it, There's a kind of openness required to understand art. And if you don't have that and you're defended, which you could relate to certain avoidant attachment styles, for example, there's somewhere to go with that. I mean, they're relating attachment to everything now, right? That's, it may be a fundamental principle of our, species being, as I like to say. I stole that from Marx, but I'm reinventing it. There. Oh, yeah. Is it on? Just talk.
Hello?
Hello.
Is it on?
We hear you.
Yeah, okay, great. You were talking about us people working around on autopilot, and then something marvels us, and then we have to kind of turn our consciousness on in a sort of different way to understand it. And or something surprises us or something strikes us. And I think it's really interesting that we walk around in this mess, and we have to make a meaning out of it. And understand it, and when we do that we make sort of narratives. And I read an essay of yours where you write about your time as a writing teacher in a psychiatric hospital.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about that, because that was really interesting.
Right. So there were two parts of this. One was that we create narratives in a way looking back, but that I was talking about the surprise aspect of consciousness, which to one degree or another I think has also accounts for our biases, right? We have a lot of unconscious biases that have to do with our autopilot existence until something really surprises us. This is an interest in how do conventions work? To what degree are conventions unconscious? So with the psychiatric patients, which is a slightly different thing, I did discover during the 4 years that I was a volunteer writing teacher that what I didn't know was that reading together as a group and writing did seem to have therapeutic benefits for the patients. I felt quite confident about that after years of doing it, that people felt better when they left than when they walked in. And, there is research on the benefits of writing with some emotional value. It can't be neutral. And it's really interesting, immune function improvement, liver improvement, respiratory improvement, 20 minutes a day for not just psychiatric patients, any person. The theory about this is very weak. Why is this the case? We need, better models to think about this. But, I think the more seriously we take reading and writing, and I always taught serious texts, really good poems or excerpts from serious literature. And those patients knew that I was treating them with dignity and respect, that that doesn't always happen, right? Because you have a psychiatric disorder doesn't mean you're stupid. But there were people who treated, psychotic patients as if they were dumb. Two very different things, right? So, also, I think teaching a writing class helped the patients not just think of themselves as a diagnosis, right, as a list of symptoms, but as human beings with stories to tell or poems to write that deflected from the institutional presence of themselves as a list of symptoms.
Hello.
There's someone. Yeah.
You said that there's no agreed upon theory. I'm here.
Where are you? There you are. Hi.
Hi. You said that there's no agreed upon theory of how the brain works. And if I understood you correctly, you're critical of this, these studies that look at what areas of the brain lights up when participants do different things.
Yeah.
So I was wondering about your opinions on reading research that combines reading research, neuroscience, and studies how reading fiction is connected to developing empathy.
Right. Yeah, so actually Karen and I had a little conversation about this. So listen, I'm very interested in neuroscience. I'm interested in how new models are being developed. This predictive coding is interesting. It's a more complex model. It's taking in what the CCTM, classical computational theory of mind, did not. At the same time, we don't really understand exactly how this relates to actual neurobiology. Wet neurons. We don't know. And so I think it's always good to keep that in mind. What was the second part? I'm sorry, I'm having Alzheimer's here. How reading fiction, Oh yes. So some of these, studies are a little dumb, right? You put the person in the fMRI, and then you say, the amygdala lights up. I'm being too simplistic. So yes, the person is having a vicarious emotional experience by reading, blah, 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 blah. They're kind of reductive and not interesting. On the other hand, I think there are really interesting studies that can be done and are now being done. And I heard about some of them today at an earlier meeting, where you can really begin to understand the effects of reading literature on people. And to my mind, the effect can only be good because it can help dignify the act of reading literature in the culture. And I think it needs that. And a little bit sadly, we seem to require, not just the testimony of people saying this is a really wonderful book, but some kind of scientific, evidence-based proof.
Thank you.
Does this work now? Yes?
Yeah.
I'm from a very different world, and the terminology today is quite alien to me, but I'll try anyway.
Yeah.
If you listen to the climate research, the reports, and the general agreement that the globe and the world is environmentally going in a wrong direction.
Yeah.
Do you think, or have you made any thoughts about, is to the extent that this can be turned around by human action, do you think the cognitive systems we have is actually able to do this?
Oh yeah, that's very interesting. I don't know, but I'm also not a climate scientist. I mean, I think that what my work and thinking may have to do with this is related to the notion that we are all connected and embedded in our environments, and that drawing these lines between the human subject, other animals, and the ecosystems is nonsense, right? And that this starts at the molecular level, right, and goes out to the macro levels. And that this requires a reorientation of our categories, of not isolating, the autonomous Enlightenment man from the air he breathes, the food he eats, and, very simple, and where he comes from, right? Our beginnings. Or I mentioned the circus fish that has a complete gonadal reorganization depending on the behavior of other circus fish. I mean, it's so incredible. Now with climate change, those behaviors can be changed by the temperature of the water. There are other fish that, they change sex because of the temperature of the water, seasonal changes, et cetera, and then you have all these fish changing sex at the wrong time, and you screw up the whole ecosystem. And we know these examples, but I think that's a great example of how this all works and how certain cognitive reorientation can help us rethink what we are. I think you have to be. Yeah.
And I think that's a really great note
to
end.
Yes. Before we get depressed. Thank you. Thank you.
Literature, Cognition and Emotions to such a wonderful start. Thanks everyone for coming, for asking questions. Feel free to take a little picnic on the way out. There are still some buns waiting for you. Let's give a hand to Siri.
Thank you.